What would you do if every door closed? Not because you weren't good enough, but because of how you looked. Would you keep knocking, or would you finally stop trying? Clara Dempsey had been rejected 17 times. Brilliant, qualified, scarred. When the world decided she didn't fit the image, she almost believed it. Until one man, the millionaire everyone called cold and calculating, did something no one expected. He hired her. But what began as a single act of defiance soon unraveled a truth far deeper than a corporate experiment. Because Jonathan Harrington wasn't just giving someone a job, he was trying to heal a wound of his own, a hidden sister, a lifetime of regret, and a company about to face a mirror it could no longer avoid. This isn't just a story about a job, it's a story about what happens when courage meets compassion, and when one decision dares to change how the world defines worth. Stay with us through this remarkable, true-to-life tale. If this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The rain had just started to fall over downtown Seattle, soft and gray, painting long streaks across the glass walls of Harrington Enterprises. Inside the lobby, marble floors gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights, reflecting a world that looked too perfect, too polished, almost sterile. Clara Dempsey stood by the reception desk, her portfolio clutched tightly against her chest. The right side of her face, smooth and calm, contrasted sharply with the faint scars that stretched along the left, pale reminders of a fire long past. She had learned, over the years, how people's eyes always lingered for just a moment too long. Some pretended not to see, others simply couldn't help themselves. She adjusted her scarf and smiled politely at the young receptionist, who looked both nervous and curious. "Miss Dempsey?" the woman asked, voice tight. "Mr. Harrington's office is ready for you, 17th floor." The elevator ride was silent except for the low hum of machinery and the faint patter of rain against glass. Clara caught her reflection in the mirrored wall. She had worn her best navy blue blazer, pressed white blouse, and simple pearl earrings, professional but modest. "You've done this before," she whispered softly to herself. "Just another interview." But deep down, she knew it wasn't just another one. It was the 14th in 3 months. And if this one ended the same way as the others, polite smiles, shallow compliments, and a silent rejection, she wasn't sure what her next step would be. The elevator chimed. She stepped into the wide hallway lined with abstract art and muted carpets. A few employees passed by, their conversations cutting off mid-sentence when they saw her. One man offered a quick nod and an awkward smile before hurrying away. Another whispered something to a colleague who tried, unsuccessfully, to hide her reaction. Clara had seen it all before. The discomfort, the curiosity, the pity. None of it surprised her anymore. When she reached the large double doors of the executive suite, she paused to take a breath. A small brass plate read, "Jonathan Harrington, Chief Executive Officer." She knocked once. "Come in," a voice called, steady, deep, and unmistakably confident. The office was vast, the kind that announced power without needing to say a word. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the misty skyline, and behind a sleek mahogany desk stood Jonathan Harrington himself. Early 40s, sharp features, salt and pepper hair, everything about him radiated control. He didn't look up immediately. "Have a seat." "Miss Dempsey?" he said, flipping through a file on his desk. His voice carried no warmth, but no condescension either. Just precision. Clara sat down quietly, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. Finally, he looked at her. His gray eyes studied her face with the kind of focus that felt clinical, almost mathematical. Clara braced herself for that familiar flicker, the half-second of shock, the awkward shift, the involuntary sympathy. But it didn't come. Instead, he said simply, "Your resume is impressive. 12 years as executive coordinator at Lanson Consulting, certified in corporate communications. You managed a team of 6. "Yes, sir," Clara replied, her voice steady but soft. "I handled logistics, scheduling, and most of the client relations." He nodded slowly, scanning the page again. And why did you leave Lanson? Clara hesitated, the truth catching in her throat. New management, she said carefully. They were restructuring their public-facing teams. Jonathan's eyes flicked up, just slightly. He understood what she meant, though neither of them said the word appearance. I see. Silence stretched between them. The rain outside whispered against the glass. Then, to her surprise, he leaned back and asked, Tell me something, Miss Dempsey. After so many interviews, why keep trying? Most people would have stopped. Clara held his gaze, refusing to look away. Because I'm good at what I do, she said quietly, and because someone, eventually, will be smart enough to see that. For the first time, Jonathan's expression changed, a brief, almost imperceptible flicker of something that looked like respect. He rose from his chair and walked toward the window, hands clasped behind his back. Do you know what this position entails? Yes, sir. Executive Secretary coordination of schedules, communication with partners, and administrative oversight. It also means representing this company in every interaction, internal and external. He said, his tone even. Many would say that requires a certain kind of presence. Clara's heart sank. She'd heard this line before. I understand, she said softly, already preparing herself for the polite dismissal that would follow. Thank you for your time, Mr. Harrington. But instead of ending the interview, he turned to face her. You think I'm about to reject you, don't you? Clara blinked, caught off guard. It's usually how this part goes. He studied her for a long moment, then said, I don't make decisions based on how things look, Miss Dempsey. I make them based on results. And from everything I've seen here, he tapped the folder lightly. You deliver them. For a second, she thought she'd misheard. I'm sorry. When can you start? The words hit her like a gust of wind. Her breath caught, her pulse quickened. She wasn't used to hearing yes. I can start Monday. She managed. Good. He extended his hand. Welcome to Harrington Enterprises. Clara shook it, half in disbelief. His grip was firm, confident but not pitying. As she left the office, the receptionist looked up, startled. Miss Dempsey, how did it go? Clara smiled faintly, still dazed, better than expected. When she stepped back into the rainy Seattle afternoon, the city lights flickered in the puddles at her feet. For the first time in months, she let herself feel a small spark of hope behind her in the top floor office. Jonathan Harrington watched the rain slide down the window pane. He whispered to no one. She reminds me of Grace. The name hung in the air like a ghost. The phone rang early the next morning, just as Clara was pouring herself a cup of coffee in her small apartment overlooking the Sound. It was still half dark outside. The air smelled faintly of rain and roasted beans. She hesitated before picking up. After so many rejections, she had trained herself not to expect good news from unfamiliar numbers. Miss Dempsey. The voice on the line was crisp, professional. This is Lisa from Harrington Enterprises. Mr. Harrington asked me to call personally. He'd like to offer you the position. You'd start Monday, if that works for you. For a heartbeat. Clara didn't answer. The words felt unreal, like someone else's good fortune accidentally landing in her lap. I got the job. Yes, ma'am, the assistant said. Mr. Harrington was very impressed. Clara leaned against the counter, eyes wide. Yes. Monday works. Thank you. Thank you so much. She hung up and stood there in silence, coffee cooling in her hand. No tears came, no triumphant shout, just quiet disbelief. Then, slowly, a smile broke through, small, uncertain, but real. By Monday morning, the city had turned bright again. The drizzle had lifted, leaving the streets gleaming under the early sun. Clara dressed carefully, navy slacks, ivory blouse, the same blazer from her interview. She tied her hair back, looked at herself in the mirror, and whispered, They hired you for your work. Remember that. When she stepped into the glass tower of Harrington Enterprises, she felt the shift immediately. The same receptionist who had looked uncertain before now smiled a little too brightly. "Good morning, Miss Dempsey." "Congratulations." "Thank you," Clara said softly. The elevator doors closed around her, sealing her in that mirrored box once again. She could see her reflection beside the city skyline, the faint scars on her cheek, the steadiness in her eyes. She took a slow breath. You belong here, even if they don't know it yet. The executive floor smelled faintly of cedar and fresh coffee. The rhythm of keyboards and hushed phone calls filled the air. People moved quickly, professionally. But when Clara stepped out of the elevator, the noise faltered, a few heads turned, a few whispers traveled like static through the air. Someone dropped a pen. She smiled politely and kept walking, her heels tapping evenly across the marble floor. Her new workspace was a corner desk outside the CEO's office. A sleek computer, an organizer, a fresh notepad, and a nameplate that read, Clara Dempsey, Executive Secretary. She ran her fingers over the engraved letters, feeling the weight of them. Morning. She turned to see Evelyn Grant, the head of HR, standing beside her. Perfectly pressed suit, immaculate nails, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Harrington likes things punctual and precise," Evelyn said briskly. "He expects every document labeled, every schedule timed to the minute. You'll find his expectations, demanding. I prefer clarity," Clara replied calmly. "It helps me perform better." Evelyn blinked, caught off guard by the poise in Clara's tone. "Right. Well, welcome aboard." As she walked away, Clara caught fragments of murmured conversation between two analysts near the break room. Is she really his new assistant? Yeah, nobody understands why. He's obsessed with perfection. Well, maybe he's turning charitable. The word stung, but she didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than any defense. Inside the glass-walled office, Jonathan Harrington sat at his desk, staring out over the city. He was a man accustomed to control every decision measured, every risk calculated. He had built Harrington Enterprises from a garage startup into a billion-dollar powerhouse by refusing to be sentimental about anything. People didn't surprise him anymore, not investors, not competitors, not employees, but she did. The way Clara had sat in front of him, nervous but unbroken, the calm defiance in her eyes when she said she was exceptional at what she did. It had unsettled him, though he couldn't have said why. People don't surprise me often, he thought, watching the fog drift across the harbor. She did. He sipped his coffee black, no sugar, and turned as Evelyn entered without knocking. "She's here," Evelyn said. "I hope you know what you're doing. The staff already has questions." "I usually do," Jonathan said evenly. "She's unconventional for this floor. You know what people will say." He looked at her, expression unreadable. "They'll say what they always say, until results shut them up." Evelyn hesitated, then nodded and left. When the door closed, Jonathan leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. He wasn't entirely sure if his decision had been driven by logic or something far more complicated. At noon, he stepped out of his office. Clara stood at her desk, organizing the week's agenda, her handwriting neat and deliberate. "Miss Dempsey," he said. She turned quickly. "Yes, Mr. Harrington, I trust you're settling in." "I am, sir. Thank you for the opportunity." He nodded, watching her movements precise, measured, almost graceful in their restraint. "Do you take your coffee black or with cream?" she asked suddenly. Without looking up, he raised an eyebrow. "Black. Thought so," she said with the faintest hint of a smile. "People who drink black coffee don't like wasting time." That caught him off guard. He laughed quietly, a rare, genuine sound that startled even him. "You're observant, Miss Dempsey." "It's part of the job description," she replied, eyes steady. When he returned to his office, he found himself still smiling. The rest of the afternoon passed in quiet efficiency. Clara worked steadily, organizing files, answering calls, aligning meetings with an almost surgical precision. But under the hum of productivity, she could feel the eyes that followed her every movement. Each whisper, each glance was a test, and every time she ignored it, she passed another one. At 5 o'clock, as the office began to empty, she packed her things. Before she left, Jonathan called out, "Miss Dempsey." She turned. "You did well today," he said simply. "Better than I expected for a first day." "Thank you, sir." He nodded once. "See you tomorrow." When she stepped into the elevator, the building was quiet again. Her reflection shimmered against the darkened city skyline, half shadow, half light. For the first time in years, Clara felt something she hadn't dared to feel since the fire: belonging. By the end of her first week, Clara Dempsey had become a quiet mystery inside Harrington Enterprises. She was always early, always composed, her desk immaculate. She spoke softly, only when necessary, and yet, wherever she went, the air seemed to shift. Conversations paused, eyes flicked away, voices dropped to whispers. In the break room, near the hum of the espresso machine, two junior analysts leaned close. "You've seen her," right one said, spoon clinking against his mug. The new secretary, for him. The one with the other hesitated, lowering his voice. "The scars." "Yeah, I don't get it. Harrington doesn't do pity hires. Maybe he's losing his edge, midlife crisis or something." The first analyst laughed nervously, but stopped when he noticed Clara standing in the doorway, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She didn't say a word, just nodded politely, then walked away. Her heels clicked softly down the hallway. Inside, she repeated the same line she'd told herself since childhood: "If I flinch every time, I'll never stop trembling." At the far end of the floor, Evelyn Grant was updating personnel files when Jonathan Harrington's door opened. He handed her a folder without looking up. "Need these contracts finalized by noon?" he said. Evelyn took the folder, hesitated, then asked, "Sir, may I speak freely?" "You usually do," he replied dryly. She folded her arms. "People are talking about her. They're confused." "I'm confused. There's got to be some personal reason you hired her." Jonathan looked up slowly, gray eyes cool and unreadable. "There is a reason. Ms. Grant, competence." Evelyn flushed. "Of course. It's just optics matter. You know how clients are. They expect a certain image when they visit this floor." He closed the file with deliberate calm. "If clients are judging our image instead of our performance, perhaps we need better clients." Evelyn's mouth tightened. "Understood." As she turned to leave, he added, "And Evelyn, the whispers stop here. I expect professionalism, not gossip." She nodded stiffly and left. But as soon as she was out of earshot, she exhaled in frustration. "He's blind to it," she thought. "He doesn't see what this could do to the company's reputation." That afternoon, Clara worked quietly at her desk, answering calls, sorting documents, managing Jonathan's schedule with meticulous care. Every so often, someone would approach with a request, eyes darting nervously to her scars before quickly looking at the papers instead. "Could you schedule a meeting for Friday?" "Of course," Clara said gently. "Would you prefer morning or afternoon?" Morning, thanks." Her tone never faltered, her smile never forced. She made things easy for people who clearly found her presence uncomfortable, and somehow that kindness unsettled them more than any argument could. Around 3 o'clock, Evelyn passed by again and stopped. "Miss Dempsey, Mr. Harrington wants you in his office." Clara knocked once and entered. Jonathan gestured toward the chair opposite him. "How are you finding your first week?" "It's busy," she said, sitting carefully. "But I prefer that. Idle hands make noisy thoughts." He smiled faintly. "Good answer. I've reviewed your scheduling work. Impeccable. You have an eye for precision." "Thank you, sir." "Anything you need?" "A bit more patience from the coffee machine," she said lightly. He chuckled a quiet, brief sound that softened the room. Noted. I'll have maintenance look at it. When Clara returned to her desk, she found a small folded note beside her computer. Great job this week, from Robert Leland. She looked up to see the older consultant waving from down the hall. Robert had been with the company since its founding. Silver hair, steady gaze, known for his fairness. Don't mind the chatter, he told her later that day as they shared an elevator. People always talk until they have something better to do. I suppose my existence gives them entertainment, Clara replied. Or a mirror, Robert said quietly. Some folks don't like what they see reflected. She smiled at that small, real. Thank you, Mr. Leland. In the cafeteria the next morning, she sat at the far end with her lunch, a turkey sandwich, an apple, and a paperback novel. She'd always preferred solitary corners. They offered peace, even when peace came wrapped in isolation. At the next table, two marketing assistants were whispering again. She's polite, though. Yeah, but still it's weird, right? A face like that at the front desk. Maybe she's got dirt on the boss. Clara turned a page in her book, her expression unreadable. Then, softly, she said, without looking up, you might want to lower your voices. Sound carries. They froze. I wasn't talking about you, one stammered. Clara closed her book, looked up, and met their eyes evenly. Then you have nothing to apologize for. She stood, disposed of her tray, and left the cafeteria in absolute silence. By Friday, something unexpected began to happen. The whispers didn't vanish, but they changed tone. People started realizing that every schedule Clara touched ran smoother. Every report she prepared was flawless. Every meeting she organized began and ended on time, something that had never happened before. When Jonathan hosted a surprise investor call that afternoon, she handled it seamlessly, anticipating what he needed before he even asked. Afterward, he passed her desk and said quietly, "Good work." "Just doing my job," she replied. He paused. "Not everyone does it this well." For a moment, the office felt still. Even Evelyn, watching from across the hall, couldn't ignore how the CEO's tone had changed. That evening, as Clara packed up her things, she caught her reflection in the dark glass of the window. The city lights shimmered behind her like scattered stars. She thought of the whispers, the stares, the uneasy silence that followed her wherever she went. And yet, for the first time, she felt no anger, only clarity. Let them talk, she told herself. In time, my work will speak louder than they ever could. She turned off her desk lamp, picked up her coat, and walked toward the elevator. Behind her, the office buzzed faintly again. But this time, the whispers carried something new. Not ridicule, curiosity. Night had settled softly over Seattle. The city below shimmered with 1,000 lights reflecting off the dark surface of Elliott Bay. From the top floor of the Harrington Tower, Jonathan Harrington watched ferries glide across the water, tiny moving constellations against the quiet black. His office, empty except for the low hum of the heating vents, felt more like an observatory than a workplace. The glass walls, the endless view, the stillness, it all suited him. Jonathan preferred distance. It kept the world in perspective. A soft knock broke the silence. "Come in," he said without turning. The door opened, and Robert Leland stepped in. He carried 2 cups of coffee, both steaming. "I figured you'd still be here." Jonathan managed a faint smile. "You know me too well." Robert set 1 cup on the desk and sat opposite him. The older man's silver hair caught the glow of the city lights. "You've been staring out that window for nearly an hour. That usually means one of 2 things. Either you're closing a deal in your head, or you're thinking about something you can't fix." Jonathan chuckled quietly. "Maybe both." Robert leaned back. "It's about her, isn't it? The new secretary?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint tapping of rain beginning to return against the glass. "Finally," he said, "you've known me 20 years. Robert, Have you ever seen me hire someone who didn't fit every line of an image, every calculation, every measurable factor? No. Robert admitted, that's what made this hire stand out. The board thinks you've gone soft. Jonathan turned from the window, his face shadowed but steady. I didn't hire her out of pity. I hired her because she's competent more than that. Disciplined. I could see it the moment she walked in. The way she held herself, even when she knew people were staring. Robert studied him. But that's not the whole story. Is it? Jonathan didn't respond, not immediately. His eyes drifted back to the window to the bay, to the faint lights of Bainbridge Island flickering in the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. She reminds me of someone. Robert waited. He had learned long ago that silence was the only way to draw truth from Jonathan Harrington. My sister, Jonathan said quietly. Grace. Robert's eyes softened. It's been a long time since I've heard you say her name. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the sound heavy. You remember the accident? Of course, Robert said gently. It was bad. Jonathan nodded. I was in New York when it happened. I should have been here. She was 24, driving back from an art show. A drunk driver ran a red light. He paused, eyes distant. The fire started before anyone could pull her out. Robert looked down at his coffee, not wanting to interrupt the confession that had been waiting years to surface. She survived. Jonathan continued, voice low, but her face. She never recovered from what she saw in the mirror afterward. Grace used to be fearless, bright, reckless in the best ways. After the accident, she disappeared inside herself. She stopped painting, stopped going out, stopped seeing anyone except the housekeeper. You tried, Robert said softly. I tried too late, Jonathan replied. I threw money at treatments, at therapy, at everything I could think of. But you can't buy someone's will to live. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Robert asked quietly, and Clara Jonathan's jaw tightened. The first time she walked into my office, it was like seeing a ghost. The scars, the calmness. It was Grace. The same kind of quiet endurance. I couldn't ignore it. Robert leaned forward slightly. So, you hired her to what? Save your sister through her? Jonathan didn't answer. He just rubbed a hand over his face, exhausted. Jonathan, Robert said gently, you can't fix one person by hiring another. I know, he said quickly. This isn't charity. Clara earned her position. She's good, better than good. But maybe having her here will show Grace what's still possible. That you can live, succeed, even when the world stares. Robert sighed. You always did have a savior complex. Jonathan gave a humorless laugh. Only when it comes to family? Does Grace know about her? Not yet. Robert hesitated. You plan to introduce them. Jonathan looked back out at the dark water. The fairies were gone now, leaving only ripples of light. Eventually, when the time's right, Robert studied him for a moment, then said quietly, just make sure you're not using Clara to heal your own guilt. The words hit harder than he expected. Jonathan turned sharply. You think that's what this is? Robert's tone stayed calm. I think you blame yourself for Grace's isolation. You see Clara as a second chance proof that you can still do something right. But you're mixing redemption with rescue. And that's a dangerous mix. Jonathan opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't deny it. After Robert left, the office felt heavier, quieter. Jonathan sat at his desk, the city lights flickering across the polished surface. He reached for a picture frame, half buried under papers, a photo of Grace before the accident. She was standing on a beach in Oregon, her hair whipped by the wind, her laughter caught mid-motion. You would have liked her? He murmured. She doesn't flinch. He set the picture down carefully and leaned back in his chair. Outside, the rain grew steadier, drumming softly against the glass. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt uncertain not about numbers or strategy, but about the line between compassion and control. Was he helping someone who deserved the chance or trying to heal a wound that would never close? He rubbed his temple and whispered, almost to himself, maybe both. The city lights blurred through the rain, and for a long while, he just watched them searching for clarity and reflections that refused to stay still. The second week began with gray skies again. Seattle always seemed to echo her moods: soft rain, muted light, everything slightly blurred around the edges. Each morning, Clara Dempsey arrived early, before most of the office had stirred. She liked the quiet hum of the printers warming up, the faint smell of coffee drifting down the hallway. In those few minutes, the building felt almost kind. By 8:00 a.m., the illusion broke. The office filled with footsteps, chatter, laughter that wasn't meant for her. People passed her desk without greeting, though some nodded out of politeness. She didn't mind the silence. It was the kind of noise that followed her everywhere that hurt more. At lunchtime, the cafeteria buzzed with energy. Conversations overlapped like the sound of restless birds. Clara stood in line, tray in hand, listening to the faint hum of gossip weaving between tables. Is she sitting alone again? Maybe she prefers it. Or maybe no one wants to join her. She pretended not to hear, ordered a simple salad, took her seat at the far corner near the windows overlooking Elliott Bay. From that distance, the city looked peaceful, boats moving like small brushstrokes across gray water. She focused on them while she ate. Every few minutes, she could feel eyes on her. A glance here, a whisper there. One woman laughed too loudly at something that wasn't funny. Another turned her body just enough to block Clara from view, as if kindness meant pretending she wasn't there at all. She took a slow sip of coffee, forcing her breathing steady. They see the scars. They don't see the ashes I rose from. Her mother's voice echoed faintly in her memory, soft, melodic, saying, "You are more than what the world decides you are, sweetheart." It had been a long time since she'd heard that voice. That afternoon, Clara sent a routine email to the marketing department, requesting final numbers for an upcoming investor presentation. She crafted it carefully, polite, professional, to the point. No one replied. By the end of the day, she sent a follow-up. Still nothing. On Wednesday morning, she overheard them near the copy room. "Did you get that message from the new secretary?" "Yeah." I didn't respond. "Why not? I don't know. Something about her creeps me out. I can't focus when she's around." "Don't say that. I'm just being honest." The words stung more than she wanted to admit. Not because they surprised her, but because she had once believed she'd outgrown the ability to be hurt by them. When she returned to her desk, she didn't say a word. She sent the email again this time, CCing Evelyn Grant and Jonathan Harrington. Within 5 minutes, the department replied with every file attached, and an apology so carefully worded it could have been polished by a lawyer. She thanked them, saved the documents, and kept working. No anger, no drama, just precision. But that night, walking to her car under the drizzle, she couldn't shake the exhaustion that came from constantly being both invisible and too visible at the same time. Thursday brought something worse. She was walking through the corridor to deliver a report when she passed a group of younger employees by the vending machine. One of them, a tall man in his 20s, turned as she walked by and muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Guess the boss has a thing for charity projects." Laughter followed, nervous, shallow, the kind that comes when people want to belong more than they want to be decent. Clara stopped, turned slightly, and met the man's eyes. Her voice was calm, her tone even. "If you have feedback about my performance," she said, "you can send it directly to Mr. Harrington. He values honesty." The boy's face flushed crimson. The laughter died immediately. She smiled politely. "Enjoy your snacks." Then she walked away, each step measured and deliberate. Inside, her heart hammered. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the file against her chest. But she didn't let it show. Not once. Because she knew if she let one cruel remark define her, they would never stop testing the limits of her silence. That evening, she stayed late, working through spreadsheets and schedules under the soft glow of her desk lamp. The rest of the office had emptied hours ago. The rain had returned, steady and soothing. She removed her glasses and rubbed her temples. Fatigue pressed at the edges of her resolve. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to remember. She was 9 years old. The night smelled of smoke and rain. Sirens wailed somewhere far away. Her mother had been in the kitchen, humming softly. When the fire started, Clara remembered the heat, the choking air. Her mother's hands pushing her toward the door, then the flash, the roar, the darkness. When she woke up days later in the hospital, her mother was gone. The nurse wouldn't meet her eyes when she handed Clara a mirror. Half her face was changed forever. The doctors said she was lucky to be alive. But at 9 years old, lucky didn't feel like the right word. The years that followed had been a long, quiet war learning to walk through rooms without apology, to hold her chin steady when people flinched, to build competence where beauty had once been currency. Now, decades later, sitting under the hum of the office lights, she realized she'd been fighting that same war every day since. Only the battleground had changed. Jonathan Harrington stood in the doorway, unnoticed. He had returned to retrieve a file he'd forgotten, but paused when he saw her, the lone figure at her desk, surrounded by the faint golden light of the lamp. She looked serene, even as exhaustion shadowed her face. He watched as she organized the last stack of papers, adjusted a calendar entry, and closed her laptop with quiet finality. No sighs, no complaints. Just the steady discipline of someone who had learned that dignity required endurance. Robert's voice from a few nights earlier echoed in his mind. You can't fix one person by hiring another. Jonathan wasn't sure anymore what he was trying to fix. But watching Clara, he knew one thing for certain: he had not made a mistake. There was strength in her stillness, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't beg, doesn't break. As she stood to leave, she caught sight of him in the glass reflection of the hallway. "Good night, Mr. Harrington," she said softly. He nodded. "Good night, Miss Dempsey." When she disappeared into the elevator, Jonathan turned back toward his office. The rain outside had softened again, streaking the city in silver. He whispered to the empty room, "They see the scars, but they have no idea who they're looking at." The following Monday began with tension thick enough to taste. Rumors had spread overnight. Harrington Enterprises was facing a PR crisis. A major tech journal had leaked a story questioning the company's environmental claims. Investors were uneasy, partners were calling, and half the communications team had gone into panic mode. At 8:15 sharp, Jonathan Harrington stepped out of his office, his expression composed but eyes sharp. "Miss Dempsey?" he said, voice calm in the storm. "Cancel everything on my calendar this morning." Clara looked up from her desk. "Everything, sir, everything. We're going to need a full reorganization of the week's meetings, especially the European calls. And I want a comprehensive schedule built by noon. I also want every message coming out of this office filtered through one voice. Yours." For a moment, the floor seemed to go silent. Evelyn Grant, standing nearby, blinked in disbelief. "Sir," she said carefully, "that's a lot to put on one person. Perhaps the communications team should I said, Miss Dempsey," Jonathan repeated, tone leaving no room for debate. Evelyn fell quiet, her jaw tight. Clara nodded once. "Understood. Mr. Harrington." By 8:30, the office was a hive of motion. Phones rang, emails flew, departments scrambled. Clara sat at her desk, her fingers flying over the keyboard, reorganizing an entire week's worth of executive schedules, matching time zones from Seattle to Berlin, Tokyo, and Dubai. Every detail mattered down to the minute. She built spreadsheets that synced flight paths, investor briefings, and media statements, weaving order out of chaos. People stopped questioning her after the first hour. They simply watched. When someone from PR asked how she wanted to handle the messaging delays, she didn't hesitate. "Transparency first," she said. "We acknowledge the error, we outline the fix, and we do it before they can guess what we'll say. But that's risky. So is pretending, Clara replied. But pretending always ends worse. Her tone was calm, almost gentle, but behind it was steel. By late morning, the crisis center had turned from panic to focus. Department heads who had doubted her were now taking notes. Even Evelyn, hovering at the doorway, couldn't help but watch in grudging admiration. At precisely 11:57, Clara placed a printed itinerary on Jonathan's desk. All international schedules reorganized, all investor calls confirmed, all press statements routed for your approval. Jonathan looked up from his computer, eyes narrowing slightly. "It's not even noon." "No, sir," she said simply. "You said by noon." He flipped through the pages, scanning the precision of her notes. Not one error, not one missed detail. He set the folder down. "You did all this alone. I asked for what I needed," she replied. Most of it was cooperation. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. "You have a way of making chaos feel quiet." Clara smiled faintly. "Organization is just controlled empathy. You learn where pressure sits, and you move it." He studied her for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, "You don't flinch easily, Miss Dempsey." Her gaze met his, steady and clear. "When the world burns you once, small fires don't scare you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jonathan felt something shift, something small but undeniable. Not pity, not curiosity, respect. The kind that can't be demanded or granted, only earned. That evening, the crisis began to cool. The press statement, released under Clara's direction, was met with cautious approval. A few investors even praised the company's honesty, calling it refreshing in an industry built on spin. By 6:00, the building had emptied again. Rain streaked softly down the windows, blurring the skyline into watercolor shades of blue and silver. Jonathan stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching the lights ripple across the bay. Behind him, Clara gathered her things quietly. "Good work today," he said without turning. "Thank you, sir. You kept the company from losing a week of productivity. Maybe more. I just did what needed to be done." He turned to face her. "You make that sound simple. Most hard things do. After they're finished," she said. He smiled, really smiled for the first time in months. The kind of smile that reached his eyes. "You might be right." Clara paused, surprised by the warmth in his tone. "Would you like me to stay and finalize tomorrow's schedule?" "No," he said. "Go home. You've done more than enough for one day." As she reached the door, he added softly, "Miss Dempsey." She turned. "Yes, sir. Thank you. Not just for the work, but for the calm." Clara nodded once. "Calm is easy, Mr. Harrington. The storm takes practice." He watched her leave, the door closing behind her with a soft click. For a long moment, Jonathan stood in the quiet, the hum of the city filling the space she had left behind. He realized something he hadn't felt in years, something beyond efficiency, beyond admiration. He felt trust, and as he turned back to the window, his reflection faint in the glass. A small, genuine smile lingered his first in months. Outside, the last of the storm clouds drifted toward the horizon. The bay shimmered in the fading light. It was, somehow, a beginning. The evening after the crisis ended, the office felt oddly quiet, like a theater after the applause has faded. Most of the staff had gone home, their laughter echoing faintly down the corridor. Only Clara remained, tidying her desk as she always did. Neat stacks, no loose paper. Every pen aligned perfectly in its tray. She was reaching to file one last folder when she noticed something out of place on the credenza behind Jonathan's desk, a silver picture frame, slightly tilted, the glass catching the soft glow of the desk lamp. For a moment, she hesitated. Then curiosity won. She stepped closer. It was a photograph, an old one, a woman standing near the ocean, wind in her hair, sunlight falling across her face. Her smile was open, fearless. the kind of beauty that felt both effortless and unaware of itself. At first, Clara thought it might be a former colleague, or perhaps an old flame. But as she looked closer, something in her chest tightened. Along the edge of the woman's jaw, barely visible beneath the sunlight, was a faint pattern, an uneven texture that only someone who knew could recognize. Scars. The same kind. The same side. The same story, etched into different skin. She exhaled slowly, her hand tightening on the folder she still held. So, that was it. Grace Harrington. The name she had heard whispered once in a passing conversation between Evelyn and Robert. The sister who rarely appeared in public. The ghost behind Jonathan's quiet eyes. Clara felt the room tilt slightly, the air heavy with something she couldn't quite name. Was she here because of her skills, or because she reminded him of someone he had lost? That night, sleep refused to come. The rain whispered against her apartment window, soft and relentless. The clock on her nightstand glowed. 2:14 a.m. Clara lay still, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts turning over like restless tides. Am I just a reminder of someone else? She tried to reason with herself. Jonathan had said she was competent. He had trusted her with impossible tasks. He had defended her when others doubted. But still, the photograph, the resemblance, the scars. It felt too exact to be coincidence. She turned on the lamp, light spilling across the room. On her nightstand sat a framed photo of her mother, smiling, holding her close, before the fire, before everything changed. Clara touched the frame gently. You'd tell me to stop overthinking, she whispered. You'd say the only thing that matters is what I do, not why someone else notices. The thought steadied her. But only a little. She closed her eyes again, and the question lingered, soft but persistent. If I'm just a reflection of his grief, what happens when he sees the cracks? The next morning, the world looked deceptively bright. The sun filtered through the Seattle haze, painting the city in gold. Clara arrived early, as usual, coffee in hand, ready to bury herself in work. She needed structure. Structure was safety. But as she approached her desk, Jonathan's door opened. Miss Dempsey, he said, his tone unusually gentle. Do you have plans this weekend? She blinked, thrown by the question. No, sir. Just rest and perhaps some reading. He nodded. I'd like you to accompany me somewhere tomorrow morning. It's a personal matter. Her brow furrowed. If it's work-related, I can prepare notes or... It's not work. He interrupted softly. It's someone I think you should meet. For a brief moment, neither spoke. His expression was unreadable, not command, not pity, something in between. She nodded slowly. Of course, Mr. Harrington. 8 o'clock, he said. I'll pick you up. The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. Clara worked efficiently as always, but her thoughts wandered. She noticed small things she hadn't before, the way Jonathan lingered a little too long on certain words when he spoke to her, the faint flicker of hesitation when their eyes met. She thought of the woman in the photograph, Grace. The resemblance had been uncanny. But it wasn't just the scars. It was something else, the calm in the posture, the quiet defiance in the way both faces met the camera. Is that what he sees in me, she wondered? A reflection? A replacement? The idea both frightened and saddened her. She wanted to be seen for who she was, for her work, her resilience, her choices, not as a shadow of someone else's tragedy. And yet, a small part of her understood the impulse. If she had lost someone, truly lost them, and found even a fragment of their spirit in another person, could she have resisted reaching out, either? She sighed softly. The line between compassion and projection was thinner than most people cared to admit. That evening, as the office lights dimmed and the city beyond turned to gold and gray, Jonathan stood in his doorway, watching her pack her things. You're early tomorrow, he reminded her. Yes, sir, she said, slipping her notebook into her bag. Harrington Estate, correct? He nodded once. It's about an hour outside the city. Bring something comfortable. It's not a business meeting. Her curiosity deepened, but she didn't press. Understood. He gave a faint smile, the same calm one she'd learned to read as gratitude. Good evening, Miss Dempsey. Good evening, Mr. Harrington. When she stepped outside, the air was cool, tinged with salt from the bay. The city lights shimmered like distant fires, reflections flickering across wet pavement. She paused by the glass doors before heading to her car. In the reflection, she caught her own face framed by the lobby light, the scars soft beneath the glow. For a moment, her mind split between two images, her own and Grace's from the photograph. They overlapped, merged, then separated again. She whispered to her reflection, almost as if testing the truth aloud. I am not her. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. And somewhere behind that quiet declaration, a small, defiant spark began to burn. Whatever awaited her at Harrington Estate, whoever she was about to meet, she would face it not as a reflection, but as herself. The next morning dawned clear and quiet. A rare kind of morning, for Seattle, thin mist rising from the ground, sunlight breaking through pale clouds like a slow promise. Clara stood outside her apartment building at exactly 8. A black sedan waited by the curb. Jonathan Harrington stepped out, immaculate as ever, though softer in the daylight, no tie, navy sweater, his expression unreadable. Good morning, Miss Dempsey, he said. Good morning, Mr. Harrington. The drive out of the city took them east along the water, for miles. The skyline fell away, replaced by dense evergreens and the shimmer of Lake Sammamish in the distance. Clara watched the world blur past the winding roads, the rippling reflection of light through trees. The silence between them wasn't awkward, just heavy with unspoken things. Finally, she asked quietly, May I ask where we're going? To my family estate, Jonathan said. There's someone I'd like you to meet. She hesitated. Your sister. His eyes flicked toward her, surprised but not angry. You've heard of her. I saw her photograph, Clara admitted, in your office. He nodded once, gaze turning back to the road. Then this will make more sense. The car rolled through tall iron gates and up a curved driveway lined with old cedar trees. The Harrington estate sat on a hill above the lake, grand but lonely, its gray stone walls veiled in ivy, the kind of house that seemed to remember too much. When they stepped inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with lavender. A housekeeper greeted them quietly, then disappeared down the hallway. Jonathan paused outside a door near the back of the house. She doesn't see many people, he said softly. If she asks you to leave, do so. Please don't take it personally. Clara nodded, her pulse quickened. Understood. He knocked gently. Grace, it's me? No answer. He opened the door anyway. The room beyond was filled with light and shadow, the curtains half drawn, the floor scattered with unfinished paintings. Canvases leaned against the walls, each depicting fragments of faces, hands, and landscapes that seemed to fade before they fully formed. At the center, seated by the window, was Grace Harrington. She was beautiful, still, in the haunting way that broken things sometimes are. The scars on her face were deeper than Clara's, older one side smooth, the other drawn slightly taut, where the skin had healed unevenly. Her hair, streaked with silver, fell loosely over her shoulders. Grace turned when she heard footsteps. Her eyes, sharp and gray like her brother's, narrowed immediately at the sight of Clara. What is this? She asked, voice low but edged. You brought her here, Grace Jonathan began. No, she snapped, standing. You think hiring my reflection will heal me. The words hit the room like glass shattering. Clara froze, unsure what to say. Jonathan's voice stayed steady. That's not what this is. Then what is it? Grace demanded. You parade someone in front of me who carries the same kind of face. You think I'll suddenly feel less like a monster because you found another one. Clara swallowed hard, then said quietly, I'm not here for you to look at. Ms. Harrington. I'm here because I work for your brother. Grace's gaze cut toward her, sharp, assessing. And what do you think this little visit is about? Then Clara hesitated. I think maybe it's about him, about trying to make peace with something he can't change. Grace's expression flickered pain, anger, and something like sorrow crossing all at once. Jonathan took a step closer. Grace, please, I just wanted you to meet her. You've kept yourself shut away for 10 years. You don't let anyone in because people stare. Jonathan, she snapped, they stare like I'm a story they can't stop reading, but one they never finish. They pity me. They praise me for surviving, like that's supposed to make me grateful for being half a person. Her voice cracked, and for a moment, the anger melted into raw vulnerability. Clara spoke softly. Maybe they don't know how to look. Grace turned toward her, eyes glistening. And you think you do? Clara met her gaze. I've spent most of my life learning how to be seen without asking for permission. It's not about how they look at me anymore. It's about how I decide to exist in front of them. The room went quiet. Even the air seemed to pause. Jonathan's shoulders eased slightly, but Grace's didn't. She crossed her arms, retreating to the window. You talk like it's that simple, Grace muttered, like confidence grows out of scar tissue. Clara's tone stayed calm. No, it doesn't grow there. It grows in spite of it. For a long time, Grace said nothing. She stared out over the lake, its surface rippling with sunlight. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter. You shouldn't have come. Jonathan started to reply, but Clara touched his arm lightly. It's all right, she said. Thank you for meeting me, Ms. Harrington. Grace didn't turn. You shouldn't thank me either. Clara gave a small nod. Then, I'll just wish you peace, for when you're ready to let it find you. She turned and left the room, her footsteps soft against the hardwood floor. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and water. Clara stood on the porch for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to still the ache in her chest. Jonathan joined her, his expression heavy with regret. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. She stopped him with a small shake of her head. You wanted to help her? That's not a mistake. He looked out toward the lake. She wasn't always like this. I know, Clara said softly. Pain changes the shape of people. Sometimes it folds them in on themselves, but you can't force them to unfold. He looked at her then. Really looked. She listened to you. For a moment. Maybe. Clara said, That's enough for now. They stood together in silence, the lake glittering below like broken glass. Inside, behind the half-closed curtain, Grace stood by the window, watching them. Her hands trembled as she touched the edge of one unfinished canvas. For the first time in years, she didn't turn away from her reflection in the glass. It began with an email. A week after the visit to Lake Sammamish, Clara opened her inbox one morning to find a short, unsigned message from an unfamiliar address. You don't know me. Or maybe you do. I wanted to say that I've been thinking about what you said, the part about deciding how to exist in front of others. It sounded brave. I've forgotten how that feels. There was no greeting, no signature, but Clara knew immediately who it was. Grace. She read the message twice before replying. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long time, searching for the right tone, something between warmth and respect, something that didn't press too hard. Thank you for writing. Ms. Harrington. Bravery isn't constant. It's borrowed in moments. When it runs out, you rest, and when it returns, you use it again. That's all it is. She hesitated, then added one more line. And you don't need to be seen by everyone. Just one person who doesn't flinch is enough to start. She hit send over the next few days. The messages continued slowly at first, cautious like footsteps across thin ice. Grace's emails were thoughtful, sometimes sharp, always honest. I used to love mirrors. She wrote once, now I cover them. They remind me of what I've lost instead of who I am. Another time, people call me strong, but they don't see that I built that strength to survive shame, not to celebrate it. Clara would read these messages late at night, sometimes smiling sadly, sometimes staring into the dark, hearing echoes of her younger self in Grace's words. Her replies were short, measured, but always sincere. "Maybe it's not about loving your reflection again," she wrote. "Maybe it's about forgiving it for changing. You survived something that took more than it gave. That means you get to define what comes next." Through those quiet exchanges, a fragile understanding began to form. Two women who had lived behind invisible glass walls, learning how to open a window, even just a crack. Meanwhile, Jonathan watched the shift from a distance. He noticed the subtle changes in Clara, how her voice had softened when she spoke about Grace, how her eyes carried a kind of gentleness that hadn't been there before. And he noticed the changes in Grace, too. For the first time in years, she was replying to his messages, even sending him sketches again, rough, unfinished works, but alive with movement and light. Still, the progress left him uneasy. One night, long after the rest of the house had gone quiet, Jonathan sat in his study, a glass of bourbon untouched beside him. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. He stared at the flames and asked the question that had been clawing at him since the day he hired Clara. Was I helping her or using her? He remembered the first time he saw Clara's resume, the impeccable qualifications, the degrees, the languages, the brilliance that practically glowed between the lines. He also remembered the photograph attached to her file, the scar. He had told himself it didn't matter, that her skill was what impressed him. But deep down, hadn't he felt something else too? Something uncomfortably close to recognition? Grace's face had haunted him for a decade, both before and after the accident. She had been so full of life, of talent, of promise. And then she disappeared behind walls he could never break through. When he saw Clara's application, it had felt almost like fate. But was it fate or guilt disguised as purpose? He closed his eyes and leaned back, the leather chair creaking softly beneath him. Did I give her that job to do what's right or to ease my conscience? The question burned more than the whiskey ever could. The next morning, he found Clara in the conference room, sorting documents for an upcoming client visit. "Miss Dempsey," he said quietly. "Do you have a moment?" She looked up, sensing something different in his tone. "Of course." He gestured toward the window. "I've been thinking about something, about my sister, about why I hired you." Clara set down her papers. "Go on." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "When I saw your resume, I knew you were the most qualified candidate. But I'd be lying if I said that was the only reason I brought you here." Clara's expression didn't change, but her stillness deepened. "I thought," Jonathan continued slowly, "that maybe if Grace could see someone like you, someone who had faced the world despite everything, maybe she'd find her way back." He exhaled. "I thought I was doing something noble, but now I wonder if I was just trying to fix something that can't be fixed." For a long time, Clara said nothing. Then she spoke softly. "You were trying to save her, Mr. Harrington. There's nothing wrong with wanting that. But people aren't projects. They're stories that have to tell themselves." He looked at her, uncertain whether to feel chastised or comforted. "I just don't want you to think you were hired out of pity." "I don't," Clara said firmly. "I know my worth, but I also know when I've been placed in someone else's story." Her tone wasn't bitter, just honest. Jonathan nodded slowly. "Then I owe you an apology." "No," she said. "You owe yourself forgiveness." Her words settled between them, like truth, quiet, immovable, unforced. That night, Grace wrote again. "I saw the sunset today. For a moment, the light hit the water just right, and I forgot about my face. I just saw color. Maybe that's what being alive again feels like, color instead of reflection." Clara smiled as she read it. "That's exactly it," she replied. "You're not your reflection, Grace. You're the light that changes it." She sent the message and sat back, exhaling slowly. Outside, The city was quiet, the bay stretching out in silver waves. In two different houses, two women with mirrored scars were learning to see themselves again, and one man, sitting alone with his conscience, was learning what it meant to truly help someone, not by rescuing them, but by letting them rediscover their own strength. The storm didn't come from the sky, it came from the boardroom. By midweek, Harrington Enterprises was all over the business news. An anonymous source had leaked a story suggesting that Jonathan Harrington had hired a disfigured secretary to boost his image as a benevolent CEO. The phrasing was cruel, clinical. It stripped Clara of her competence, her intellect, her dignity, reducing her to a prop in someone else's narrative. Within hours, the story spread. Investors called, journalists emailed, and by afternoon, a major corporate partner, Veridian Technologies, announced they were reevaluating their partnership pending reputational review. It was the first real crack in the empire Jonathan had spent 20 years building. At 5 o'clock, the executive board gathered in the top-floor conference room. The air felt like a verdict before a word was spoken. "We can't let this spiral," said Harold Keene, the board chairman. "Veridian's withdrawal will trigger others. We need a public response." Jonathan sat at the head of the table, expression carved from stone. "We already released a statement clarifying the falsehood. It's not enough," another director insisted. "The optics are bad. Investors are questioning your judgment. They're saying you let sentiment cloud business decisions." "And what exactly do you suggest I do?" Jonathan asked, voice low. Harold folded his hands. "You need to remove the catalyst of the controversy." The room fell quiet. Everyone knew what he meant, Miss Dempsey, Jonathan said. The words dry as ash. Harold nodded. "Temporarily, at least. Frame it as a leave of absence. Make it clean. You'll protect the company and your reputation." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, eyes moving from one face to another. All of them loyal men and women who had profited from his brilliance for years, now afraid of a single bad headline. "So, to protect an image," he said slowly. "You want me to sacrifice a person." "It's not personal," Harold said. "It's public relations." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Everything worth anything is personal." No one met his gaze. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "This meeting is over." That night, the building was empty except for two people. Clara had stayed late, as she often did, working quietly in her corner office. She already knew about the rumors. She had seen the online comments, the ugly phrases written by people who hid behind anonymity. Pity hire, PR stunt, modern-day charity case. Words could bruise even when no one said them aloud. When Jonathan appeared in her doorway, she didn't look surprised. "Long day?" she asked gently. He didn't answer, just stepped into the room. The soft click of the door behind him marking the boundary between professionalism and something heavier. "They want me to fire you," he said. Clara looked up, her hands stilled over the keyboard. "I figured as much." He laughed once, without humor. "Of course you did." Silence settled. The hum of the city beyond the windows filled the space where words couldn't. Jonathan leaned against the edge of the desk, arms crossed. "They say it's about protecting the company image, about optics, investors, reputation." Clara folded her hands. "And what do you say?" He stared at the floor for a long time before answering. "I say they're cowards. But I also say I can't ignore the numbers. Veridian's withdrawal alone could cost us 1/4 of our revenue. The ripple could destroy everything I've built." Clara nodded slowly. "Then you have to make a choice." His voice cracked slightly. "Don't make this easy for me." She smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "I'm not—" Another silence, deeper this time. Then, softly, she said, "If you fire me, it's okay. Truly. But then you'll have to live with knowing you agreed with them." Jonathan's eyes lifted sharply. "That's not fair. Neither is life," she said. "But that's the choice they're giving you. Them or the truth." He took a slow breath, exhaling through clenched teeth. "And if I don't fire you?" he said quietly. I might lose everything I've built. Clara met his gaze, unwavering. Then maybe it's time to ask what it was built on. The words hung between them, gentle but devastating. He turned away, walking toward the window. Outside, rain had begun to fall, streaking down the glass like liquid silver. I don't know what I'm doing anymore, he confessed. I thought integrity and success could coexist. But maybe that was naive. Clara stood, her voice steady. It's not naive. It's rare. He turned back to her. The city lights reflected in his eyes. You're not supposed to be the one comforting me. You know? She smiled sadly. Then stop giving me reasons to. They both laughed softly, tired, fragile laughter that came more from exhaustion than humor. The laughter faded, replaced by quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when everything that can be said has been said, and all that remains is choice. Jonathan looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to memorize something, her calm, her resilience, the way she never once looked away, even when the world gave her every reason to. Finally, he said, almost to himself, You shouldn't have to carry this. I'm not, Clara replied. I'm just refusing to drop it. He nodded slowly, his throat tight. Then, very softly, he said, Whatever happens tomorrow. Miss Dempsey, thank you. She tilted her head. For what? For reminding me who I wanted to be before the world told me who I should. When Jonathan left the office that night, the rain had turned into a downpour. He didn't open his umbrella. He just walked down the empty street, past the glowing reflections of city lights and puddles, each step heavy but certain. He knew the morning would bring consequences. He also knew his decision was already made. Sometimes, losing everything you've built is the only way to remember what you stand on. The morning after the storm broke, the Harrington headquarters was a battlefield disguised as a building. Camera crews gathered across the street, waiting for statements. Reporters shouted questions as executives hurried inside. Employees walked faster, whispering, glancing nervously toward Jonathan's office as if his decision might decide their futures too. Inside, the tension was electric. The board had convened again, this time without ceremony. The topic was singular, Clara Dempsey. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, shoulders squared but face drawn from sleeplessness. Clara wasn't in the room. She had been asked politely but firmly to remain in her office until things settled. They never would, and everyone knew it. Harold Keene cleared his throat. Mr. Harrington, we need closure on this issue before market open. The optics are worsening by the hour. Jonathan didn't answer. He stared out the window at the gray morning light spreading over Elliott Bay. Sir, Harold pressed, this is no longer about sentiment. It's about survival. Jonathan turned slowly. If survival means surrendering principle, what exactly are we surviving for? A few board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Harold's voice hardened. With all due respect, you built this company on results. If this scandal costs us our partnerships, our results will vanish. Sometimes leadership means knowing when to cut a loss. Before Jonathan could respond, the door burst open. Every head turned. A woman stood in the doorway, tall, pale, dressed simply in charcoal gray. Her long coat hung open, her posture straight despite the faint tremor in her hands. Her face, half smooth, half scarred, was unmistakable. Grace Harrington. The boardroom froze. Jonathan rose slowly, his voice barely a whisper. Grace. She met his stunned gaze with calm defiance. You didn't think I'd let you fight this alone. Did you? No one spoke. No one even breathed. The silence was so complete it seemed to hum. Grace walked into the room, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She scanned the faces around the table, men and women who had known her name for years, but never her story. Some averted their eyes. Others stared, unable to look away. Ms. Harrington. Harold began carefully. This is a private meeting. Grace turned to him, her voice low but cutting. Then consider me an uninvited conscience. Jonathan stepped toward her. You shouldn't have come. The press, I don't care about the press, Grace interrupted. I care about truth, and about what this company is about to do to an innocent woman because of fear. Her gaze swept the room. You think firing Clara will make the world respect you more. It won't. It'll prove them right that image is worth more here than integrity. Harold frowned. Miss Dempsey has become a distraction. You can't ignore public perception. Grace took a slow breath. Her scars caught the light as she turned fully toward him. You think image builds empires, she said, each word deliberate. It's character that sustains them. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Jonathan exhaled softly, watching his sister, his reclusive, broken sister, stand taller than any executive in the room. She's right, he said finally. We can't build something worth having if we're afraid of how it looks. But the investors, one director began. Let them walk, Jonathan said. We'll build something they'll wish they hadn't abandoned. The board erupted in protest, voices overlapping panic, fear, outrage. Through it all, Grace remained still, a calm center in the chaos. Finally, she spoke again, her tone quiet but absolute. You can rebuild money, you can rebuild business, but once you sell your soul for acceptance, there's nothing left to rebuild. The noise died again. Harold's expression softened just barely. He rubbed his temple. Defeated. You understand what this means? Mr. Harrington. Jonathan nodded. I do. Then the board will make its decision, Harold said grimly. You already did, Jonathan replied. Now, I'm making mine. The meeting ended not with applause, but with silence, the kind that signals something irreversible. Grace followed Jonathan out of the room, her steps steady despite the tremor in her hands. In the lobby, a few employees froze mid-conversation as they saw her. Phones lifted, flashes flickered. Grace paused, startled by the burst of cameras through the glass doors outside. For a second, her instinct was to turn away to hide, but then she remembered Clara's words. It's not about loving your reflection again. It's about forgiving it for changing. She turned back toward the light. The reporters shouted questions as, Harrington, how do you feel returning to the public eye? Are you defending your brother's decision? Do you stand by the secretary he hired? Grace met their lenses head on, her expression calm and proud. I stand by the truth, she said simply, and by the people brave enough to live it. The crowd fell silent not from agreement, but from something rarer. Respect. Later that day, the photo appeared everywhere. Grace Harrington, once a ghost, standing in the lobby of her brother's company, face half in shadow, half in light. The image went viral before noon. Some called it staged, others courageous. But for the thousands who saw it and recognized themselves in her scars, it meant something more. It meant possibility. In his office, Jonathan watched the photo spread across news feeds, interviews, and commentary panels. He should have felt triumph, but instead, he felt a deep, aching mix of pride and worry. Grace had spent a decade building walls to protect herself. Now, with one step into the open, those walls were gone. When she entered his office later that evening, he rose immediately. You shouldn't have done that. I had to, she said. If I didn't speak, I'd be complicit in their cowardice. He studied her, saw the faint tremor in her shoulders. The cost of her courage. They'll turn this into a spectacle. Let them, Grace said quietly. Maybe some good will come from it. He sighed, rubbing his temples. I don't know whether to thank you or be furious with you. She smiled faintly. Try both. It keeps you balanced. They both laughed softly, the sound fragile but real. Jonathan walked to the window. You realize what you did today changes everything. I hope so, Grace said, because if it doesn't, what's the point of all this pain? He turned to face her. You sounded like her. You know, who Clara? Grace's smile deepened, tinged with warmth. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Outside, evening light spilled over the city like gold dust, reflecting off the glass towers. Inside, for the first time in 10 years, Grace Harrington stood unhidden and unafraid. 2 weeks after Grace's unplanned appearance in the boardroom, the storm of headlines had shifted tone. What began as scandal had become something else, a movement, a debate, a story people couldn't stop talking about. Harrington Enterprises announced it would not only stand by its principles, but double down on them. And now, the company was preparing for the Innovation Expo, an annual event that drew hundreds of investors, engineers, and journalists from across the country. It was Jonathan's idea to make a statement not through press releases or damage control, but through purpose. He wanted the keynote presentation delivered by Grace and Clara. When he first suggested it, the room went still. Grace looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "You can't be serious." Jonathan nodded. "Dead serious. The new sustainable tech project is your design, Grace, and Clara's execution. You two are the embodiment of what this company stands for: resilience, intelligence, and truth." Grace shook her head slowly. "You know what will happen. People will stare." Clara, sitting quietly beside her, said softly, "Then let them—" Grace turned toward her, startled. "We'll teach them how to see," Clara continued. The words hung in the air, soft, steady, certain. Jonathan exhaled, something close to a smile tugging at his mouth. Then it settled. Grace laughed, the sound dry and nervous. "You two are absolutely mad." "Possibly," Clara said, "but madness built most of what's worth remembering." The next several days became a rhythm of work and worry. Grace and Clara met in the design lab each afternoon to practice going over slides, refining timing, editing transitions. At first, Grace struggled. Her hands trembled when she spoke. Her eyes darted toward the mirror-like reflection of the presentation screen, then away again. Clara never pushed, never corrected. She just listened. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the glass walls, Grace sighed heavily. "It's not the words I'm afraid of," she confessed. "It's the eyes. All those people, all that watching." Clara leaned against the desk, her voice quiet. "When I was 9, I used to hide in the school library during lunch. Kids would stare, whisper. I thought if I stayed invisible long enough, the world would forget what I looked like." Grace turned to her, curious. "Did it work?" "No," Clara said, a small smile tugging at her mouth. "But it taught me something. The more I hid, the smaller I became. Not just to them, to myself." Grace studied her for a long moment. "How did you stop hiding?" "I got tired," Clara said simply. "Tired of shrinking." Over the next few days, something shifted between them. Their rehearsals became less about perfecting words and more about grounding courage. When Grace's voice wavered, Clara would breathe with her slow, steady, in rhythm until it steadied again. When Clara stumbled on technical phrasing, Grace corrected gently, her old confidence returning in flashes. They laughed sometimes, surprising themselves with how natural it felt. On the third night of practice, Jonathan walked into the lab quietly, unnoticed at first. He watched as Grace and Clara stood side by side before the projection screen, timing their sentences, finishing each other's thoughts like two halves of one rhythm. For the first time in years, he didn't see scars. He saw power. He left without interrupting, the faintest smile in his eyes. Later that evening, when the building had emptied and silence filled the halls, Grace turned to Clara. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." Grace hesitated. "When you look in the mirror, what do you see?" Clara considered before answering. "It depends on the day. Some days I see every scar. Some days I see a woman who learned how to live anyway. Both are true." Grace nodded slowly. "I haven't looked in a mirror in 10 years. Not really looked." Clara walked to the far wall, where a full-length mirror leaned against a cabinet, draped in a gray cloth. Without speaking, she lifted the cloth away. The mirror caught the faint light from the city outside. Grace stood still, her breath shallow. Clara met her eyes in the reflection. "You don't have to," she said. "But if you want to, I'm here. For a moment, neither moved. Then Grace took one hesitant step forward. The reflection sharpened two women standing side by side, the lines of their scars illuminated in soft light. Grace's voice trembled. "I don't even recognize myself." Clara's tone was gentle. "Then maybe it's time to introduce yourself again." Grace let out a fragile laugh. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," Clara said, "but it's possible." They stood there in silence. The air hummed with electricity, not from fear, but from something like rebirth. "Finally," Grace whispered. "You know what's strange? When I look now, I see both of us. I see survival." Clara smiled faintly. "That's what they'll see too if we let them." The night before the expo, Grace couldn't sleep. She paced her studio at the estate, the walls lined with unfinished paintings. She stopped at one canvas, a portrait she had abandoned years ago. A woman's face, half complete, fading into light. She picked up a brush and, with slow, deliberate strokes, began to finish it. In the morning, the first light of dawn spilled through the window, glinting off wet paint. The woman in the portrait no longer looked unfinished. She looked whole. At the same hour, in her apartment across the city, Clara stood before her bathroom mirror. She touched the faint curve of her scar and smiled softly. Not with pride, not with sorrow, just acceptance. Her reflection looked back without hesitation. For the first time in a long time, she didn't see damage. She saw a life still unfolding. By sunrise, the two women would stand on a stage together. People would stare, yes, cameras would flash, whispers would ripple through the crowd. But this time, neither of them would flinch, because this time, they were not reflections. They were the light itself. The day of the Innovation Expo arrived like a pulse of electricity through Seattle. The convention center stood gleaming on the waterfront, banners fluttering in the crisp air. The name Harrington Enterprises emblazoned across glass walls in silver and blue. Inside, 4,000 people filled the grand hall. Investors, engineers, journalists, students. Cameras lined the aisles. Every seat was taken. Jonathan stood backstage, adjusting his cufflinks for the 10th time, though they didn't need adjusting. His heart pounded harder than any board presentation he'd ever given. He looked toward the curtain where Clara Dempsey and Grace Harrington waited. Grace wore a slate gray dress, simple and elegant. The scars on her face were visible in the lights, not hidden, not emphasized, just there, as part of her. Clara stood beside her in black, her presence calm, grounded, almost luminous. "You ready?" Jonathan asked quietly. Grace exhaled slowly. "No." Clara smiled. "Perfect. That's what courage sounds like." Grace huffed a small laugh, her hands trembling slightly. "If I faint out there, you're finishing the speech." "If you faint out there," Clara said, "I'll make sure it's the most graceful collapse anyone's ever seen." They both laughed softly. Then the stage manager gave the cue. The lights dimmed. The murmuring crowd quieted. A single spotlight found them as they stepped onto the stage. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly silent. Grace felt it, the collective intake of breath, the reflexive shock, the thousands of eyes all turning toward the scars she had spent a decade hiding. Her throat tightened. Then she heard Clara's voice beside her, low and steady. "Good morning, everyone." The steadiness in that voice was an anchor. Grace breathed and followed. Clara began with structure logic, data, vision. She spoke of innovation, of how empathy and design were not opposites but twins. She introduced Grace as the creative force behind the company's newest sustainable systems models that used waste heat to power green networks. The audience leaned in. The presentation flowed like music, Clara with her precise rhythm, Grace with her quiet passion. Then, halfway through, Clara paused. She glanced toward Grace. Grace swallowed hard, then stepped forward. "When I was 24, she began, her voice trembling slightly, A car accident took the life I thought I was meant to live. I stopped painting. I stopped working. I stopped seeing myself as part of the world. The hall fell silent. Even the cameraman froze. For 10 years, I lived in shadows. People said I was brave for surviving. But survival isn't bravery, it's biology. What takes bravery, she said softly, is learning to exist again when you no longer recognize the person in the mirror. She looked out over the audience, thousands of faces, most of them wide-eyed, some glistening with unshed tears. And then, she continued. Someone reminded me that my story wasn't over. Her gaze flicked to Clara. She showed me that scars are not the end of beauty. They're proof that healing happens. Grace stepped back slightly. Her part finished. The applause began hesitant, uncertain, then subsided as Clara stepped forward again. Clara's tone shifted steady, measured, carrying the quiet power of truth. When you walked in today, she said, you saw us. Two women whose faces tell stories you might not understand. And maybe, for a moment, you wondered why we're here, on this stage, representing a company that builds technology. She paused long enough to let the silence breathe. It's because innovation isn't just about machines or data or profit. It's about people, about refusing to let appearances define potential. Her eyes swept across the audience. We live in a world obsessed with perfection, a world that filters, edits, and erases anything that reminds us of imperfection. But the truth is, she inhaled softly, voice thickening. Perfection doesn't inspire change. Humanity does. She took a step closer to the front of the stage. You can teach a computer to think, but not to care. You can program precision, but not compassion. That's what makes us human, and that's what keeps progress from losing its soul. Another pause. Cameras clicked, breath held. Some of us, she said quietly, carry visible scars. Others hide theirs where no one can see. But scars don't make us less human. She looked toward Grace, her voice soft but unshakable. They make us living proof that pain can create purpose. The hall stayed silent, utterly silent. 4,000 people, frozen in place, processing. Then, slowly, like the first clap breaking through thunder, someone began to applaud. Another followed, then another, and then the sound swelled, roaring, rising, rolling through the hall like a wave. People stood, entire rows. The camera lights flared as the crowd rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, crying. Jonathan watched from backstage, his throat tightening. Grace stood with her head bowed, overwhelmed. Clara reached over, squeezing her hand gently. You did it, Clara whispered. Grace shook her head, tears in her eyes. We did. By the time the applause faded, the internet was already alive. Clips of the speech spread like wildfire, first among attendees, then on social media, then on national news. The hashtags trended within hours. I just purpose over perfection, almost see beyond scars, I just go appearance bias. Commentators called it a turning point for inclusive leadership. Some called it the most human moment in tech. But for Clara and Grace, none of that mattered. What mattered was the stillness that came after the quiet certainty that they had turned pain into something that reached beyond them. Later that night, back in the hotel room overlooking the bay, Grace stood at the window, watching the lights ripple across the water. Jonathan knocked softly and entered. You were extraordinary, he said. She smiled faintly. You really think so? I know so, he replied. She looked back out at the city. You know what's strange, she said. For the first time in 10 years, I wasn't afraid of being seen. Jonathan stepped beside her, his voice low. That's because you finally decided what you wanted them to see. She turned to him, her smile small but real. And what's that? He hesitated, then said, Strength. Her gaze softened. Then I think we both found what we were looking for. Across the bay, the city shimmered, its reflection broken but beautiful. And for the first time in a long time, so were they. The morning after the expo, the world felt louder. Screens glowed with debate. Headlines flashed like lightning. Two women redefine courage in tech, exploitation or empowerment scars, sympathy, and the price of inspiration. The video of the speech had crossed 100 million views in 48 hours. And with that attention came a storm beautiful, brutal, and utterly unstoppable. On social media, the world split into two. Half the voices lifted Clara and Grace as icons of resilience. See Beyond Scars became a rallying cry. Women wrote about facing judgment for aging, weight, skin, disability. Veterans shared photos of their wounds, calling them badges of living. But the other half, the cynics twisted the narrative. They mocked. They doubted. They accused Jonathan of orchestrating everything as a marketing stunt. Inspirational porn, sympathy sales, manipulation masquerading as empowerment. Every post, every headline, every whisper scraped like gravel across the company's reputation. Inside Harrington Enterprises, tension returned different this time, heavier. The board called an emergency session. Harold Keene looked pale, tired. Jonathan, this has gone beyond a PR issue. Investors are nervous again. Some are threatening to withdraw funding. Jonathan stood by the window, the morning sun outlining his frame in hard gold. He'd barely slept, but his voice was calm. "Let them withdraw," he said quietly. Harold blinked. "Excuse me." Jonathan turned, his expression steady. "I won't build success on shallow ground again. Not one brick of this company will stand on shame or fear. We stand for what we said we stood for, or we don't stand at all." "You're risking everything," Harold warned. Jonathan smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time to find out what everything really means." The room fell silent. For once, no one argued. Across the city, Grace's inbox overflowed. Hundreds then, thousands of messages poured in. From mothers, soldiers, burn survivors, teenagers who'd stopped going to school because of scars or conditions they couldn't hide. Each email carried a story, each one a small piece of pain, written in trembling words. "I watched your speech with my daughter. She has a birthmark on her face and has never felt beautiful. Last night, she told me she might stop covering it. I lost my leg in a fire. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a mistake. I used to hate mirrors. Then I saw you on that stage." Grace read each one slowly, tears blurring her vision. She had spent so many years believing her life ended with the accident, yet now, through every word, she could feel that ending turning into a beginning. But then, one email stopped her cold. The subject line was simple. "I owe you an apology." Her hands trembled as she opened it. "Ms. Harrington, you don't know me, or maybe you do. I'm the man who drove the car that night, the drunk driver who took your face and your peace. I've lived every day since then with a guilt I can't describe. I saw your speech yesterday. I almost turned it off, but I didn't. I saw what you've become, what you made of what I ruined, and I realized I've spent 10 years punishing myself for something you turned into meaning. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to say, I'm sorry. Truly. You deserved better than the pain I gave you. Michael Tate." Grace sat motionless. The room seemed to shrink, sound fading into a soft hum. Michael Tate. She had heard the name only once in court, through the haze of pain and morphine. For 10 years, she had buried that memory under layers of bitterness and avoidance. Now, the past had written to her, and it wasn't asking for punishment. It was asking for peace. That night, she couldn't sleep. The letter echoed in her mind, every word, every regret. She walked down to the lake, the air crisp and quiet. The water glimmered under a thin slice of moonlight. Jonathan found her there hours later, sitting on the old wooden pier with the letter folded in her hands. He sat beside her without a word. For a while, they just listened to the sound of the water. Finally, she said softly, "He wrote to me." Jonathan didn't ask who. He already knew. What did he say? That he's sorry. Jonathan nodded slowly. "Are you going to reply?" Grace stared out at the rippling water. I don't know. You don't owe him forgiveness, he said quietly. I know, she whispered, but maybe I owe myself freedom. Jonathan turned to her, studying her face in the moonlight. Grace, if you forgive him, it doesn't erase what he did. She smiled faintly. Forgiveness isn't about erasing. It's about not letting it carve deeper. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she unfolded the letter again, reading it one last time. Her voice was calm. Even, he said he's been punishing himself all these years. Jonathan sighed. Then maybe it's time one of you stopped. Grace nodded, the corners of her eyes glistening. Maybe both of us. She took out her phone, opened a blank email, and began to type. Mr. Tate, I received your letter. For a long time, I wanted to hate you forever. It was easier than forgiving you. But yesterday, I stood on a stage and told the world that pain can create purpose. If I meant those words, then I have to live them. I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I do. Grace Harrington. She hit send. For a long moment, she just breathed slow, deep, trembling breaths. Then she whispered, It's done. Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder. No, he said softly. It's begun. The next morning, a faint fog hung over Lake Sammamish. Grace stood on the porch, watching sunlight spill through it like gold smoke. The firestorm online still raged. The critics still talked. The investors still hesitated. But none of it mattered anymore, because peace, once it arrives, doesn't ask for permission to stay. 3 months after the firestorm, the air inside Harrington Enterprises felt different, calmer, more deliberate. The world had not forgotten the expo. It had only begun to absorb it. The viral clip of Clara and Grace's speech continued to circle the globe, reshared, quoted, dissected. The criticism had faded into the background noise of a larger conversation, one about value, bias, and what makes someone worthy. Out of that conversation, something new was born. It began quietly, as Jonathan's idea scribbled on a notepad one sleepless night. 3 words at the top of the page, the Merit Initiative. The concept was simple, radical, even. All hiring, promotions, and evaluations at Harrington Enterprises would now be based solely on demonstrated competence. Every resume would be stripped of names, photos, ages, and educational pedigree. Every performance review anonymized and scored purely by contribution, collaboration, and innovation. No faces, no assumptions, only merit. Jonathan introduced the plan to his executive team in a morning meeting overlooking Elliott Bay. This isn't a campaign, he said. Voice, even. It's a correction. Rachel, the head of communications, frowned slightly. You really think removing identity will work? Jonathan met her gaze. I think we'll finally find out how much potential we've been missing by not trying. A beat of silence. Then Clara spoke from the corner of the room, her tone quiet but steady. People talk about fairness like it's theoretical, she said. It's not, it's measurable. If we measure the right things, Grace, who had taken on an advisory role, added, and it's visible too. Fairness changes the air in a room. You can feel it. Jonathan nodded. Then let's give people air they can finally breathe. The announcement made headlines again, but this time, the tone was different. Harrington Enterprises to launch, blind hiring revolution. From viral speech to policy shift, the Merit Initiative. Can fairness be engineered? Critics who had mocked the expo now praised the boldness of turning words into structure. Companies that had once distanced themselves began calling to learn how it worked. Within weeks, other firms from manufacturing to finance began adapting versions of the program. The phrase worth beyond appearance became shorthand in industry circles for merit-based ethics. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt something like peace. Not triumph, not vindication, just peace, the kind that comes from doing the right thing and letting it stand on its own. One Friday evening, After the first round of blind evaluations had been completed, the three of them, Jonathan, Grace, and Clara, gathered in the small glass conference room overlooking the city. A late spring rain streaked the windows, the city lights smearing into gold and red. Jonathan poured coffee for all three of them, a small ritual that had become their anchor in long weeks. Grace smiled faintly. "You've come a long way, brother. You used to measure success in numbers." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "And now you measure it in oxygen." He chuckled softly. "Oxygen?" Grace nodded toward the window. "You gave people air the chance to breathe without fear of judgment? That's rarer than profit," Clara added quietly, "and harder to build." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the rain. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. "Do you ever think about how strange this all is? How one job interview turned into—" This Clara smiled. "You mean a movement? Maybe?" Grace looked at them both, her eyes thoughtful. Strange, yes, but inevitable too. The world was always waiting for someone to prove that decency could scale. Later that night, as the rain eased, they walked down to the waterfront together. The harbor lights shimmered across the wet pavement. Tourists passed, unaware that the three figures walking quietly along the boardwalk were the same people who had sparked a global conversation. Grace leaned against the railing, watching her reflection ripple on the dark water. She said softly, "When people look at me now, they still see the scars first, but they also see something else. I used to think healing meant forgetting. It doesn't. It means being seen and standing there anyway." Jonathan looked at her, his tone gentle. "You've become stronger than I ever imagined." Grace smiled. "No, just less afraid." Clara turned to both of them. "Fear doesn't vanish. We just stop letting it pick the direction." Jonathan laughed quietly. "That sounds like something my sister would say." "Or maybe," Clara replied, smiling, "something you finally learned to hear." The next morning, the official report on the merit initiative landed on Jonathan's desk. Results: a 27% increase in applicant diversity, a 14% increase in productivity across departments, 0 turnover among new hires in the first quarter. But the most striking number was one line at the bottom: employee trust in company leadership up 48%. Jonathan read it twice, his throat tightening. For years, he'd believed leadership meant perfection, a cold, calculated control of outcomes. Now he realized it meant something simpler: trust, integrity, and the courage to build systems that don't crumble under scrutiny. He looked out the window toward the gray horizon and whispered to himself, maybe this is what success was supposed to feel like. That evening, Grace and Clara joined him in the rooftop garden. The sun was setting, the sky painted in streaks of lavender and gold. Grace held up her phone, scrolling through a new headline. They're calling the Merit Initiative the Harrington Standard. You're officially a benchmark. Jonathan laughed, shaking his head. The day I become a benchmark, bury me under paperwork. Clara smirked. Too late. It's already policy. The laughter faded into a comfortable quiet. Then Grace said softly, "Do you ever wonder why this matters so much? Why something as simple as fairness feels revolutionary?" Clara looked up at the fading light. "Because we've spent centuries teaching people how to judge. Maybe now we're finally learning how to see." Jonathan nodded, his gaze lingering on the skyline. "Seeing," he murmured. "That's the hard part, isn't it?" Grace smiled faintly. "It always was, but it's easier when you stop looking for perfection." They stood there as the last of the sunlight disappeared, leaving only the glow of the city imperfect, alive, full of worth beyond measure. The lake was still that morning. A soft mist floated across its surface, curling around the wooden dock that stretched into calm, silver water. The air carried the faint scent of pine and early spring rain. It had been 1 year since the expo. 1 year since the world had learned the names Clara Dempsey, Grace Harrington, and Jonathan Harrington. Now, the three of them sat side by side on the same weathered bench overlooking Lake Sammamish, wrapped in the kind of silence that only exists between people who have walked through storms together. Grace held a thermos of coffee, steam curling up into the cool air. Clara had brought a small notepad, as she always did, full of ideas for future projects. Jonathan sat in the middle, a folded newspaper resting on his knee. The headline read, "The Millionaire Who Changed How America Hires." He chuckled softly, tapping the page. "You see this? They make it sound like I did something heroic." Clara smiled faintly. "You kinda did." "Hardly," Jonathan said, shaking his head. "Heroes act on instinct. I acted on guilt." Grace leaned back, her gaze on the horizon. Guilt can be a beginning. It just can't be the end. Jonathan considered that, his eyes tracing the slow movement of the water. Maybe, but I think what came after, that was something else. He paused, voice dropping lower. "What I did next," he said, "wasn't charity." He looked toward both of them, his expression soft but clear. It was clarity. For a while, no one spoke. The wind moved gently through the trees, rustling the grass. Grace broke the silence first. "You know, they keep calling the Merit Initiative the biggest cultural shift in corporate America. But to me, it was something smaller, more human." Jonathan turned to her. "How so?" Grace smiled, eyes distant. "Because for me, it wasn't about changing systems. It was about breathing again, about walking into a room without flinching, about realizing that people were finally looking at me, not around me." Clara nodded slowly. "That's the real change when dignity stops being rare." Jonathan's eyes softened. "And you?" "Clara, what's changed for you?" She thought for a moment before answering. "I used to think strength meant not caring what people thought. Now I know it's caring deeply, just not letting it define you." Her voice quieted. The whispers haven't all stopped, but I've stopped listening for them. Grace smiled at that, a faint shimmer in her eyes. "You know, you sound like someone who's finally at peace." "Not peace," Clara said gently. "Purpose." A pair of geese drifted past on the lake, their reflections gliding like brushstrokes. The morning sun began to break through the mist, spreading a soft golden haze over the water. Jonathan unfolded the newspaper again, scanning the column. "They're calling us a case study now," he said, half amused, half wistful. "Harvard wants to include the Merit Initiative in their leadership curriculum. Apparently, we're the definitive model for human-centered innovation." Grace laughed. "That sounds very impressive." Jonathan shrugged. "It sounds clinical. They make it sound like a formula." Clara smiled. "Maybe it is just not the kind you can teach." "It's a formula made of people." He looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his mouth, and a few well-timed miracles. Grace took a sip of coffee, watching the sunlight sparkle off the water. "You know, I still get letters," she said softly, "from people with scars, disabilities, anything that makes them feel other. They tell me the same thing. I finally went outside." She looked down at her hands. "Can you imagine that? That stepping outside your own door is an act of bravery." Clara nodded. "It always was. We just didn't say it out loud before." Jonathan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That's why the Merit Initiative had to happen, not just for business, for humanity." He smiled slightly. "I used to think leadership was about getting ahead. Turns out, it's about bringing people along." Grace's voice was soft. "You brought me along, Jonathan. When I'd given up on myself." He turned to her, eyes glistening. "You walked back on your own. Grace, I just opened the door." The three of them sat there, the moment stretching simple, quiet, full. After a while, Clara flipped through her notepad, finding a page filled with handwritten notes. "I've been thinking," she said, "we could expand the program, partner with universities, nonprofits, maybe even government offices. Teach merit-based evaluation as policy, not just practice." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "You planning to change the whole country now?" She grinned, just the parts that needed. Grace chuckled, so, all of it. They laughed, the sound rolling easily into the air. The conversation faded into comfortable silence again. The lake shimmered brighter now, the mist thinning until the world looked newly made. A breeze lifted Jonathan's newspaper, the pages fluttering before settling open again, right on the article's closing paragraph. He read it aloud, voice steady. What Jonathan Harrington did next wasn't about redemption or image. It was about vision, the kind that sees through the skin of things, the kind that reminds us that progress is not about creating perfection, but recognizing worth. He lowered the paper slowly. You know, he said, sometimes journalists surprise me. Clara tilted her head. Do they get it right this time? Jonathan smiled. For once, yes. He folded the paper neatly and set it beside him. Grace watched a pair of children playing near the dock, a boy skipping stones, a girl laughing as each one bounced across the surface. Do you think, she asked quietly, that the world's really changed? Clara followed her gaze. Not overnight, Jonathan added, but maybe that's not how change works. He looked out at the horizon, the sunlight catching in his gray hair. The world doesn't transform in a single moment, he said slowly. It shifts, one decision at a time. He turned to them both, a quiet conviction in his tone. It starts when one person chooses to see beyond what the eyes can measure. The three of them sat together, watching the ripples widen across the lake, small circles moving outward, touching everything they reached. And in that gentle, golden silence, it was clear the ripples had only just begun. In a world that moves too fast, we often forget to truly see each other. We look at faces, not stories. We judge by comfort, not by truth. But this story reminds us that real worth is never worn on the skin. It's built in quiet choices, in resilience that asks for no applause. Clara, Grace. And Jonathan showed us that healing doesn't begin with perfection. It begins with acceptance. That forgiveness isn't weakness, it's release. And that one act of fairness, one moment of courage, can ripple farther than we imagine. Each of us, no matter our scars visible or hidden, has the power to turn pain into purpose, to choose understanding over judgment, to look beyond what the eyes can measure, and see what the heart already knows, that value is not about how the world sees us, but how we choose to see the world. So, as you go on with your day, ask yourself, whose story are you overlooking, and what beauty might you find if you dared to look deeper? Thank you, dear friends, for staying with us through this story, a story of courage, forgiveness, and the quiet power of seeing beyond what's visible. If this tale touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing stories that inspire hope, remind us of kindness, and celebrate the strength of the human spirit. Until next time, keep shining, keep believing, and remember, every life holds a story worth seeing.